Welcome to the podcast. I'm Angela Bobier, and this is Life in the Talbot Settlement, brought to you by Tyrconnell Heritage Society and Backus-Page House Museum. In this series, we will do our best to give you a full appreciation of the history of Western Elgin County in southwestern Ontario, from First Nations through the original European settlers to the 1950s. I'll cover one topic per episode, with the first 8 setting the tone for who we are, where we are, and what we do here at Backus-Page House Museum. Please follow us on all social media by searching at Backus-Page House, spelt Backuspagehouse. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Welcome to the second episode in our podcast, Life in the Talbot Settlement. Today I'll be chatting about the founder of the Talbot Settlement, Colonel Thomas Talbot. Thomas was responsible for placing settlers in what became 29 townships along the north shore of Lake Erie in southwestern Ontario. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage and Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. Talbot has been an honored name among English nobility since Richard Talbot, a Norman knight, settled in England during the reign of William the Conqueror. A century later, another Richard Talbot left England to assist King Henry II in asserting authority in Ireland. In 1174, as a reward, Richard received a royal grant of the fief of Malahide, where he built a castle on a limestone elevation beside the Irish Sea. The Talbots were one of the longest families to inhabit one area and castle in Ireland, having ancestral lands since the 12th century. Born at Malahide Castle in Dublin on July 19, 1771, Thomas Talbot was the 4th son in a family of 12 children of Sir Richard Talbot and Lady Margaret O'Reilly Talbot. Being the 4th son, Thomas would have had to make his own way in the world, as only his eldest brother would inherit the titles and lands of his family. Thomas spent his childhood years at Malahide Castle and Dublin, among the highest rank of nobility. He was educated in his early years in Malahide and later at Manchester Free School in England. Thomas began his military career as an ensign in the 66th Regiment of Foot, a unit in the military, at age 11, a few weeks before his 12th birthday. On September 27th of 1783, 3 weeks after the signing of the treaty that ended the war with the American colonies, Thomas was advanced to the rank of lieutenant and decided to retire with half pay at age 13. Anyone else wish they could retire at age 13? From 1786 to 1788, Talbot was an aide-de-camp to his distant relative, the first Marquess of Buckingham, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, George Nugent Temple Grenville. This surrounded Talbot by the environment of the Dublin court. Talbot first came to Canada in the spring of 1790 at the age of 21, when he sailed to join his regiment, the 24th Regiment of Foot, doing garrison duty in Quebec and then Montreal. Mostly from Buckingham's recommendation, Talbot became a private secretary and aide to Colonel John Graves Simcoe, the first lieutenant governor of the newly created province of Upper Canada in the year 1792. Talbot stayed with Simcoe as a secretary for 4 years. On one of Simcoe and Talbot's trips, they went to where Simcoe later planned to establish his capital, modern-day London, Ontario, at the forks of the Thames River. This never happened, and York, now Toronto, is the provincial capital of Ontario. On this trip, Talbot would have seen the land that was one day to bear his name, and the idea of founding his own colony took place in his mind. Thomas again took to the battlefields in Holland and Germany, fighting the French in the 85th Regiment of Foot as a captain in the Duke of York's army. The following year, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel in the 5th Regiment of Foot in England. But after 5 years, he sold his commission abruptly on Christmas Day of 1800. Because of his rank and connections, Talbot had much influence in government. For instance, he had an intimate relationship with Francis Gore, the 3rd Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, along with his wife and staff who treated him like family. Talbot applied for a grant of land in the township of Yarmouth in modern-day Elgin County on Lake Erie. If Yarmouth was already taken, then Talbot was to have any other township he might choose. The settlers he placed on land were to be from either Europe or America and be placed on his grant of 5,000 acres, which he promised would be used for agriculture and cultivating hemp for sailcloth, cordage, paper, and lamp oil. This would provide for 100 families. This arrangement called for a maximum grant of 20,000 acres for Talbot's own benefit. Talbot was accompanied by 4 others he hired in York, now Toronto, a Corporal William Powers, Patrick Wheeland, George Crane, a retired British Army officer, and Samuel Rogers. He also hired a survey crew headed by William Hambley, deputy surveyor. Talbot captained his small boat called the Mayflower and landed in Port Talbot the 21st of May, 1803. Clearly, Talbot admired the Pilgrims of 1620 who sailed from England to America on a ship called the Mayflower. He and his employees built a log house on the hill facing the lake to the south, overlooking the valley of Talbot Creek to the northeast. The log home had 3 rooms, a storeroom, sitting room, and kitchen. What the home lacked in beauty, the location it was in made up for it. He called his little log cabin Castle Malahide after his old home back in Ireland. The nearest European settlement was 40 miles away at Charlotteville, east of Long Point. On May 31st, Talbot hired William Caffrey and records that Daniel Walker came to live with him on June 13, 1803. That month, he also hired carpenter James Whitten from Niagara and his apprentice James Newlands to construct more buildings. Anne Lawler was also hired to assist Mrs. Powers, his housekeeper, and we assume the wife of Colonel William Powers. Isabella Finlay from Glasgow, Scotland, was hired by Talbot in May of 1806 and left his service in December of 1806, we assume to marry George Crane. The first watermill was built at Talbot's own expense, a short distance above the mouth of Talbot Creek. It is said to have been working by 1808, but was burned down by American marauders during the War of 1812. After the completion of the sawmills, since no European settlers had come yet, Talbot invited First Nations from nearby reserves to celebrate the completion, and it is said they in turn adopted him as a member of their group. In 1812, another house was built, and the first abandoned to fall prey to the erosion along Lake Erie. Talbot was a simple man. In the words of the settlers, Talbot baked his own bread, milked his own cows, made his own butter and cheese, washed his own clothes, and ironed and dressed his own linen, despite being aristocratic and living his life around nobility all his life. During the War of 1812, Colonel Talbot was the commander of the London and Western Districts militias of Middlesex, Norfolk, and Oxford. They took part at the Battle of Lundy's Lane and Fort George. After the War of 1812, the Talbot settlement developed rapidly along with the rest of Upper Canada. Talbot would deal with applicants wanting to acquire land through a window of his house. When the window was closed, people would have to wait. And if he didn't approve of the applicant, he would slam the window shut. This system of working through a window took place after Talbot was thrown to the ground and handled very roughly by a Highlander named Duncan Patterson. Mr. Patterson held him on the ground until he was promised the desired location. After this incident, the colonel was more cautious and would have his personal servant, Geoffrey Hunter, release the dogs once Talbot rejected applicants. He was infamous for writing the settlers' names on the settlement map in pencil. If displeased, or if the settler didn't complete their settler duties in the approved time, he would simply erase their name from the map, taking away their rights to the land, and then give it to someone else. In 1817, the town of St. Thomas, now a city, was named after the colonel. He supervised the construction of a 300-mile, 480-kilometer road running along Lake Erie. This road linked the Detroit River and Lake Ontario. Because Talbot did his work so well, the government placed the southwestern part of Ontario under his charge. This presented Talbot with the opportunity of extending the road from the Long Point region all the way through to the Detroit River. In the years 1816 to 1818, a large number of Scottish settlers came from New York, the Red River Settlement, and Argyllshire, Scotland, and were given land in Aldborough and Dunwich. These settlers did not like Talbot very much because they faced higher fees in obtaining their deeds than other settlers, plus Talbot kept more land than he was supposed to, while the settlers got 50 acres and not the promised 200 acres. He is said to have ruled the settlers like the Irish aristocrat that he was. In many cases, Talbot would place them on lots not yet granted to him, providing the settlers with 50 acres and keeping the other 150 for himself. When the government learned of this, they initially refused to grant him title to the lands, but eventually relented, demanding that Talbot submit a plan of locations and a signed statement that the settlers listed thereon were each resident on the land. There was much controversy around Talbot, mainly because he kept the original 5,000 acres, locating settlers outside of this land, and dropped his promise of growing hemp on the acres. Talbot submitted the plans as requested, with the locations for 186 settlers in 1821, receiving 50 acres in trust for each, and an outright grant for himself of 40,420 acres. By 1836, when his activity in his agency was slowly coming to an end, an official assessment revealed that he settled 500,000 acres, representing a little over 3,000 lots, with a population Talbot claimed of 50,000. By 1837, he had placed settlers in 29 townships spanning from Long Point to the Detroit River. Talbot never married or had children. Because of this, in 1833 he asked his nephew, Julius Airy, to live with him and take over the land when he passed away. Julius found it too isolating, so in 1843, Talbot asked his other nephew, Colonel Richard Airy, to live with him and promised to transfer all the land. Airy arrived with his family in 1847, but displaced Talbot in the process. In 1848, Talbot left for a trip to England with his companion and servant, George Macbeth. They stayed almost a year, and upon returning, Talbot had an argument with Richard, who did not approve of Talbot's habits and clothing. Richard was also jealous of George Macbeth as he realized that his own position was not secure. Talbot decided to give Richard half of the estate and the other half to Macbeth with a small allowance, £20, for a widow of another former servant. Talbot left for England again in the summer of 1850 and stayed for another year. During this time, he got sick and his health declined. Once he returned home, he found that Richard had left and had been renting the home to John Sanders. Macbeth offered Talbot to live with him in London, and that's where Talbot remained until his death. Talbot died February 5, 1853, at the age of 83 in London, Upper Canada. He is buried in the cemetery of St. Peter's Anglican Church near Tyrconnell in Elgin County, just down the street from our museum. Backus-Page House Museum is fortunate to have one winding sheet as part of our collection, and it is said to be the one Colonel Talbot was wrapped in for part of his journey from London to Tyrconnell, where he was prepared for burial. From a letter written on September 21, 1994, by Wilma Henriksen to Ken Welch, here is the story of the winding sheet. Dear Ken, soon you will have the winding sheet itself. It's on the way. And the answers to all those questions, or most of them, will be obvious. Thought I had done a good job of describing it, but evidently not. As you will see, it's a sheet, by no means a comforter, or intended for warmth. In older times, bodies were not dressed in their best clothes before being placed in the coffin for viewing. Families of substance throughout Northern Europe had their own linens for the purpose, removing them after the funeral, but before interment. This sheet, used long ago by the Blackwood family, was probably woven in Scotland. My guess would be somewhere near Edinburgh. It is, of course, linen and has several small darns. It probably dates from the middle of the 18th century, since James Blackwood or his brothers brought it here, said to be old then. James, the youngest to emigrate, came to Montreal to go into business with his brothers in 1828. I do not believe it was ever used by any of the family in Canada. There is one story of possible use, however, which I heard from my Aunt Georgina, your grandmother. When old Colonel Talbot, famous in Canadian history, died, he was badly served by men who worked for him, who are said to have brought his uncleaned body in a hay wagon, heading for St. Peter's Anglican Church in Tyrconnell. They stopped in Wallacestown for food and drink, though it appeared they had plenty of the latter already, probably the good whiskey old Talbot had on hand. When James Blackwood saw the wagon stopped in front of his store, with his old colonel's body so shabbily treated, he and his own people cleaned the body and wrapped it in the Blackwood winding sheet. When Talbot's drivers were well fed and judged to be sober enough to drive to the lake, they were allowed to go on. Presumably the rector or others at the church saw to it that the sheet came back. Like many of my Aunt Georgina's other wonderful stories, this is completely undocumented, and there is nothing at all like it in any writings I have seen on Colonel Talbot. If you offer the sheet to a museum or place it on display at your shop, just say rumored or alleged, but it certainly aids to the provenance, doesn't it? It is certainly of museum quality, maybe not ROM in Toronto, but in London? You might wish to give it to a church for redoing into altar clothes when you've seen it through. Your choice. I imagine St. Peter's would be glad to claim it. It really is your choice, both because your mother admired it and because of your interest in weaving. If you don't want to be bothered, you might just want to give it to Linda Galbraith, Ron's wife of Mount Bridges. She has a strong interest in genealogy, including the Blackwoods. Love to you and Helen, Wilma. I feel there is so much more that we could tell you about Colonel Thomas Talbot. Perhaps in the future we'll do an entire series about Colonel Talbot and various points in his life. The information from this podcast was from the books Lake Erie Baron, The Story of Colonel Thomas Talbot by Fred Coyne Hamill, The Story of the Talbot Settlement by Wayne Padden, and The Talbot Regime, or the First Half Century of the Talbot Settlement by C.O. Ermatinger. Thank you for listening to our podcast about Colonel Thomas Talbot in Life in the Talbot Settlement, getting you acquainted with our founder. For more information and to contact Backus-Page House Museum, our website is www.backuspagehouse.ca. The Backus-Page House Museum and Tyrconnell Heritage Society acknowledges the land we are on today as the traditional territory of First Nations people, the Neutral Nations, and then the Iroquois. We value both the significant historical and contemporary contributions of all original peoples. Life in the Talbot Settlement is a production of Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum, funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage. Your host has been Angela Bobier. Music provided by Jack Witmer. And thanks to our producers Katlyn Reintsma and Stephen McLachlin. Catch our next episode, which is about the First Nations and their history. Share the podcast with your friends by following us on all our social media at Backus-Page House. Thank you so much for listening.